how smart animals are. Did I get that
exactly,
right?
That's exactly
Oh, good. I got it right. So let's walk through that a bit. And I would like, if you would as well, this point that our perceptions and our thoughts are shaped by our morphology in some fundamental way. You make a nice example of gibbons, for example, and the fact that octopi and elephants and primates can be intelligent in a particular way because they have manipulable appendages, unlike, say, dolphins.
Yeah, so let me give an example how we mismeasured the animals. So elephants, there was the question, do elephants use tools? So what people did is they take an elephant at the zoo, they put some food outside of the cage, you give the elephant sticks, and the elephant doesn't do anything with the sticks. If you do the same experiment with a chimp, of course he takes the stick and reaches the food and brings it close to him and then eats the food. So the chimp will use the stick to get the food. The elephant didn't do that. And the conclusion of that study was that elephants are not tool users. Then a couple of years later, another research team, they did a smart thing. They hung some food very high so that the elephant couldn't reach it. And they put in his enclosure a bunch of boxes, wooden boxes. And what the elephant did is he would grab a box, bring it close to under the food, put it under the food, and then stand on top of the box and reach the food. So he was using a tool, clearly. The conclusion of that research team was that an elephant, the trunk, we think it's like a hand, but the trunk is also a nose, of course. And if the trunk reaches for food, it needs to close itself when it grabs the food, and the elephant was not ready to close his nose while he was grabbing food. But if he could stand on boxes, that would work for him. And so we need to think in terms of the animal and its physical features, and that a trunk is not an arm, it's not the same thing. We need to start thinking like the animals, and then we can solve a lot of these problems of their intelligence.
Our appendages, in some sense, are primary tools. And so if you don't give an animal a problem that it can solve with its primary set of tools, it's obviously not going to be able to solve it. And so that also brings us into the issue of embodied perception, because I read a great book called Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which J.J. Gibson, which is, man, that's a classic book. It's something brilliant. And, his premise fundamentally is that we see with our hands in some real sense, is that when we look at the world, we basically construe it as a set of grippable objects. Now it's more complex because we see walkable surfaces and climbable, what would you call climbable slopes and so forth. So it's not just hands, but that our eyes function to map our hands onto the world. I think it's a brilliant book.
And that's why we understand a chimpanzee much better than an elephant.
Or a dolphin.
A chimpanzee has hands and has binocular vision. So we are completely in tune with the chimpanzee and not in tune with an elephant or a giraffe or whatever it is. Yeah.
Right, and that understanding is a consequence not so much of mutual misunderstanding, so to speak. It's much more profound than that. It's because our cognitive and perceptual architecture is actually scaffolded off our morphology. If the morphology is different enough, we wouldn't be able to understand the animal even if we could communicate, because none of the presuppositions would be the same. I think E.O. Wilson, was it Wilson who said, if we could speak with a lion, we'd have nothing to say to him, something like that. Or he might have said it about ants.
I think it was Wittgenstein.
Oh, okay. Okay. I know a number of people have made similar comments, but you also detail out the developing understanding of the gibbon hand and species-specific face identification.
Yeah, so the gibbon hand is interesting because the gibbon has almost no thumb. So it's more like a hook. He hangs by the hand. And so when they tested tool use on the gibbon, the gibbons were not using tools at all. They never did anything until a smart investigator lifted the tools up a little, because the gibbon cannot pick up something from the ground. And since the gibbon doesn't live on the ground, he lives up in the trees, it doesn't matter for the gibbon that he cannot do that. But in the experimental situations, they couldn't pick up the tools. So yeah, you always have to test animals, and that becomes ever more complex. For example, the elephant has 100 times better smell, olfaction than the dog. The dog probably,
Wow.
and the dog probably 100 times better than us. So you can imagine the elephant, you need to test them probably on olfaction. So recently,
Right.
Josh Plotnick, a former student of mine, he did an experiment with elephants in Thailand, where he would give them 2 buckets. In one bucket, he would put sunflower seeds, and the other one was empty. And then the elephant, of course, with his trunk could not look into it, but with the trunk would smell and would pick the bucket with the sunflower seeds. Then he started to vary the quantities, and he found that elephants can distinguish a bucket with 120 seeds from a bucket with 100 seeds. So they can count with their nose, so to speak. They're so sensitive, no animal can do that, I think. But the elephant can do that.
So they can estimate quantity olfactorily.
Yeah.
Wow. And has the limits of that discrimination been tested?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at that paper, he has been testing by making the differences smaller and smaller, yeah.
Oh, that's really something. Well, yeah, we have no idea how most animals' brains are arranged around olfaction, not vision. We're really weird in that regard. It's like us and birds of prey, and maybe some close primate relatives. That's it. The rest of the animal kingdom, it's almost all smell. And we can hardly even imagine what a world like that is like.
So the brain business is interesting because at some point, 5 years, 6 years ago, people said we should not look at brain size, not even a brain size relative to the body. We should just count the number of neurons. And that will give us an index of the intelligence of an animal. And of course, everyone was convinced at that time that humans have the most neurons. We have 85 billion neurons or something like that. Until a couple of years later, it was found that the elephant has 3 times more neurons than the human.
Mm-hmm.
And then that theory was abandoned because humans need to stay on top.
We radically underestimate the relationship between intelligence and morphology. I thought about this in particular with regards to dolphins, who have quite a remarkably large brain and a large brain in relation to their body size, and say, well, dolphins are intelligent. It's like, well, it's possible that they're intelligent in some way we don't really understand, but they don't have hands. And so they can't build anything. And our prefrontal cortex emerged in large part out of the motor cortex across the course of evolution. And it looks like what we do with our prefrontal cortex is primarily map out action and manipulation before implementing it. And so, again, we think of the world as a place we can grip and move. And when we think about problem solving cognitively, we're really looking at